Justice League of America, Exterminators by Christopher Golden. Right, what is this? I don't know if most people are aware of this, but DC Comics, and I believe Marvel Comics as well, does publish a few paperbacks, which means that these are novels. They're paperback novels. They're not comic books. So no pictures, just text on a page like you would buy out of an airport, featuring their comic book superheroes. So if you want to read about like Batman and Superman, but you want to read about them in a novel rather than a comic book, you can do it. Now, why on earth would anyone read these? Why on earth did I read them? Bear with me. I think this is common for most people. I have within kind of all of my interests, kind of roughly about 10-year cycles, where I'll be really interested in one thing, I'll read a ton about it or get really interested about it, and then I'll get bored with it and stop. And then roughly about 10 years later, I come back to it and I think, why did I stop reading about that? That was really interesting again. That was really interesting actually. And I'll pick it up again and start reading about it and then get bored again. And I'm 40 now, so I'm at a point in my life where I'm able to identify a few different cycles of this happening up until now. Comic books were one of these things. I was really into comic books. I was into DC comic books specifically. Around about the time of 14, 15, 16, and around 17, I started to kind of feel like I was over it. Like I was kind of getting a little bit too old for this stuff, and that was all getting a little bit silly and ridiculous anyways. But then round about the time I hit 27, I thought, why did I stop reading that? Comic books are really fascinating, actually. And this was round about the time that Wikipedia started kind of coming out, where it was much easier to access the history of all these comic book characters than it had been before when I was a teenager in the 90s. And yeah, the bizarre history of a lot of these kind of long-standing comic book characters just fascinates me. How you can kind of trace their evolution all the way back from the 40s through the 50s through all these different stages. Anyways, that's a digression. So around that time I started getting back into comic books kind of, or at least dabbling a little bit. Although, when you're 27, it's a bit more embarrassing than when you're 17 to be reading comic books. Around about that same time, I read a book called On Writing by Stephen King, which I think a number of you are familiar with. One of the pieces of advice you might remember from that book is Stephen King said, if you want to be a writer, you have to read a lot. He said, just read anything and everything. Read everything you can get your hands on. And he said, don't even worry about whether you're reading great literature or trash literature. Because he said kind of all reading is good reading. And he said kind of reading this trashy pulp novel is going to help you just as much to be a good writer because you're going to kind of realize exactly what not to do. So he said, I'm giving you permission to just read all your guilty pleasures, pick up whatever you want. I had some literary ambitions at the time, so that was kind of my MO for a while, is just kind of picking up whatever trashy novels I wanted and guilty pleasures that I no longer felt guilty about because I felt like Stephen King had given me permission. So I spent some time where rather than reading the comic books themselves or the graphic novels, I read novels based on comic book characters. Actually, I've already reviewed a few of them so far, and there will be a few more to come as I work my way through my old reviews, which is what the scripted review series is. So anyways, that's my excuse for reading this. Now, why in the world would anyone else read these, huh? Because, they're published as mass market paper books, so I'm not the only one reading them. Somebody else must be buying them. Why is anyone else reading these? I have no idea. I mean, why not just go and read the comic book instead of reading a novel based on comic book characters? But at least that's my excuse. Now, all that being said, I know I'm fronting this as a guilty pleasure, but this book is actually not half badly written. It is actually pretty well written. And the author, Christopher Golden, is not primarily a comic book writer. He's like a proper writer who they hired to do this project, which is probably why it's so well written. The plot is completely ridiculous, but what do you expect from a book that's called Justice League Exterminators? The story does have a couple twists along the way, which I'm not going to spoil completely, but the basic premise is that 10 years previous, there was this mysterious rainfall over the UK, which caused several ordinary people in the United Kingdom to develop superpowers and later mutate into giant monsters. Now, the premise of having this in the UK is interesting. Maybe it shouldn't be. But it is because American comic books are so American-centric. And, I guess this made sense once upon a time. But now that everything's kind of a global market, it is kind of silly that all the superheroes are in America. I mean, superheroes are kind of silly to begin with, but if you buy into the premise that there is this world where superpowers and aliens are just popping up everywhere, then why does it pop up everywhere only within the United States? Why aren't there a whole bunch of French superheroes and Chinese superheroes? And I know that comic book writers have occasionally tried to remedy this a little bit. I think there was like an attempt to write like the Great 10, who was that? Grant Morrison was writing about these Chinese superheroes. I know if you go through the archives of comic book history, you can pick out various superheroes that were not written to be specifically American, but it's predominantly American, isn't it? So, interesting change of pace having all these characters be from the UK. The writer of this book, though, Christopher Golden, I looked up his bio on the internet, he's from America. So it's an American writing UK dialect, or American writing a British dialect. I'd be interested to know what a British person thinks of the dialect in this book. To me, I thought maybe it sounded like he was trying a little bit too hard to work in all these kind of stereotypical British colloquialisms. But I'm an American, I don't know any better than he does. I'll quote from parts of the book. This is the dialogue. "Look, mate, give it up already. You tried the bloody shotgun, you silly git. You think a blade's gonna do any more damage than that?" Graff spat and then laughed, more than a little lunacy in his voice. "Which one are you? Where's your costume?" Brian shrugged. "Don't need one. Not a sodden superhero, am I?" I don't know. Is that a little bit cheesy, or is that the way British people actually talk in real life? Let me know, especially if you're British. There's also a character here called Ian Parrington, who's a normal guy, ordinary British person, develops superpowers, and then quickly becomes best friends with everyone in the Justice League. Now this reminded me of what's popularly called on the internet a Mary Sue story. Or is it? I don't know. It never really becomes so obnoxious, but is it? Yeah, I don't know. Now, this book, it's called Justice League of America Exterminators, and it focuses mostly on the Justice League characters. You know, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Aquaman, Flash. Which is interesting. I mean, to me, what I find fascinating about comic books is always kind of the more obscure characters, or the characters that were really popular at one point in history and then have kind of sort of faded away. And I would think the kind of person who would buy a paperback novel based on comic book characters is maybe the kind of person like me. They're a geek. They want to get into kind of these more obscure superheroes, the ones that aren't done to death. Now that comes through a little bit near the end of this book, where the Justice League Reserves and the Justice Society and the Titans kind of come into the end of the book, kind of the last third. But most of this book is just kind of the standard Justice League of America, the Batman, the Superman, the Wonder Woman. Yeah. I think, well, I don't know. I would think maybe DC Comics might get more success publishing these books that deal with more niche characters, because this probably is a niche audience. But I don't know. They probably know what they're doing. It is noticeable, especially reading this in a novel form maybe, how much these characters have been done to death. I mean, how many times do we need to be told that Batman is a moody guy who slips in and out of shadows? Or how many times do we need to be told that Wonder Woman is a dazzling Amazon beauty? It's funny because, you know, as a kid, I used to think it would be the greatest job in the world to be a comic book writer, to be the person who got to write the Batman stories. But kind of reading this novel and kind of reflecting on it a little bit, that job would suck, wouldn't it? I mean, whenever you're writing a Batman or a Superman or a Wonder Woman story, you've got very limited creative freedom to do what you want. You just have to kind of hit the cliche notes that have to pop up in every Batman story. Now at this point, kind of 70 or 80 years of Batman or whatever, it's been done. Like imagine you're tasked with writing the new Batman movie and a new Batman story, and you have to write about how Commissioner Gordon is waiting on a rainy rooftop night, and all of a sudden Batman slips up behind him and Commissioner Gordon is like, "Where do you come from? I didn't even notice you came in." And then Batman just suddenly disappears in the middle of the conversation, and Commissioner Gordon is like, "How did he do that? He's always slipping in and out of shadows." And that scene has just been done so many times by this point, but you just have to do these cliche scenes again and again. But what am I complaining about, huh? I bought the book. If I didn't want to read this, I guess I shouldn't have bought it. But yeah, it is noticeable just kind of how boring and cliche these characters have become and how the same scenes repeat over and over again. Yeah, in retrospect, becoming a comic book writer probably isn't as fun as I imagined it as a kid.